States. You're very harsh on the media, as we talked about, including, you mentioned this network, you mentioned Washington Post, you do.
So over the weekend, Bernie Sanders was on CBS News for a wide-ranging interview on a number of topics. This interview was about 30 minutes long with host Margaret Brennan, and the topic of the media came up. Now, this is one that Bernie sometimes mentions offhand, but rarely ever goes too in-depth with, and especially rarely ever offers an actual solution to the problem. Here, he offers a real solution. So I have a couple of clips in this video. The second clip gets to the potential solution, or at least the way he wants to see this addressed. But the first one here I find kind of amusing because Margaret Brennan clearly is a little offended by Bernie's talk, his criticisms of the corporate media, because Brennan, of course, is a part of the corporate media. But here is Bernie addressing that criticism.
We have a political system which is increasingly corrupt, because as a result of Citizens United, billionaires can put enormous amounts of money into it to elect their candidates. And we have, 8 major media conglomerates, corporate media conglomerates, that control about what 90% of the American people see, hear, and read. Those are really issues that we need to discuss. That's what the book does.
Do you worry when you talk about the corporate media that you are targeting journalists when you say that?
No. Donald Trump talks about fake news, and that's simply to deflect attention from the fact that he's a pathological liar. My experience one-on-one with media, they work hard. They very rarely am I misquoted. But what I am talking about, Margaret, is that corporate media limits the kind of debate that we have in this country. Mm-hmm. You tell me, you know more about it than I do. How often do we talk about income and wealth inequality?
We're talking about right now, Senator.
Yeah, but how often? Not everybody is Bernie Sanders on your show. How often do you talk about concentration of ownership? How often do you talk about the fact that we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all, and yet we spend twice as much money? How often do you talk about that if somebody has a baby in Finland, they're getting 9 months off or 10 months off paid family leave?
I will talk to you about paid leave for families any day of the week. They also have like a 56% tax rate in Finland, though. It's a very different system. But
good, but let's talk about it. What do they get for that? They get free health care, right? Mm-hmm. Free higher education. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That's the debate I want, and that's the debate we really don't have on the corporate media.
All right, so I'm going to get to the second clip where Bernie discusses his potential solution, or at least a way to address this problem with corporate media and the concentration of these discussions within a handful of massive companies. But first, quickly here, yes, this is about Bernie's new book. So we're discussing his book there. I forgot to mention it. It's called It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism. Sounds interesting. But on his point, so it's not just about the kinds of discussions taking place. It is about the framing of the discussions. So a great example I saw over the weekend, this is actually a story from a couple of years ago, but it highlights the problem here. So this is the initial New York Times, this is from about 2 years ago. New York Times headline was "Strike at Largest U.S. Wholesale Produce Market Threatens Supply Chain." So the headline is telling you here, who is the victim? The victim here isn't the workers. The victim is the supply chain, which ultimately impacts those at the top of the company or impacts consumers. And where is the blame going? The blame is going on striking workers as opposed to the people running the companies that are not giving these people what they deserve. So to show you what I mean here, and just to be clear, they eventually changed the headline once the strike ended. So that's why I can't show you the actual New York Times headline here, but this is the first headline. Somebody went in and made a little edit with the words that are crossed out here is what the headline should be. So look at the red words here. Why market workers are on strike. They want $1 an hour raise. That's what the headline could have been. That, hey, these workers are on strike. They're asking for a dollar raise, as opposed to strike at largest wholesale produce market threatens the supply chain. Just based on framing here, it completely changes the discussion. It now puts the onus, this new headline puts the onus on those actually running the company who are too greedy to give their workers an hour $1 raise, even though their workers are the ones that are producing their profit for them. This is an ongoing problem. This is one example, but when you read headlines, when you hear stories, whether it's on TV or papers or wherever, just take a second to think about how they are framing the discussion, because that alone often gives away where the actual bias is, because these places pretend to be unbiased. They have no bias. They all have a bias. I have a bias. My bias is different than their bias, but we all have biases. So it's about understanding where that bias is and being able to take in the information, understanding that there is a built-in bias with it. In the case of a place like New York Times or CBS, when they are discussing issues around workers and capitalism and corporations, their bias is always towards corporations because they themselves are massive corporations. Now, let me get to Bernie's idea here. So it's touched on in this Common Dreams piece. Sanders proposes New Deal for journalism to ensure media serves public interest. Here is that part of the discussion in the CBS interview.
You also talk about a new deal for journalism and rethinking of the role of public and community media in the United States. You're very harsh on the media, as we talked about, including, you mentioned this network, you mentioned Washington Post, you do.
Didn't I say all kinds of nice things about you?
No, some other journalists here. You did give a shout out to Cara Corte and some other reporters. But you say you take direct aim at the media for not asking the questions that you think need to be asked. How do you, on this New Deal idea, how can you have the U.S. government in any way involved with the media and direct funding when trust in the government is so low in this country and trust in media is low?
Okay, two separate issues. Number one, what I say in the book is that, look, I have done 1,000 interviews like I'm doing with you right now. And nobody has ever come up to me, not one reporter, not you, not anybody else, that said, Bernie, why are we spending twice as much on healthcare as any other country, and yet we have 85 million uninsured or uninsured? How many programs have CBS, NBC, ABC had on why we have a dysfunctional healthcare system? Does that have anything to do with who owns the major networks? Bernie, what are you going to do about income and wealth inequality? Do you demand, why are billionaires paying an effective tax rate lower than working class people? No one asked me those questions. Okay.
No one tells us the questions to ask.
I understand that, but there's a culture in the media. No one tells people who work for me not to vote for Donald Trump. Surely, I will guarantee you they don't. I never tell them to do it. But then there's another issue, and that is a totally different issue. We are seeing media deserts in this country. Local newspapers are going out of business. So people get no news from their city council, their school board.
Real issue.
How do you deal with that? And the reason they're going out of business is private sector companies can't make money anymore because of the radical transformation of media. What happens? Do people not know what's going on in their city? How do you deal with that? Well, in European countries, what they do is they do it through a non-partisan public funding of media. I think that's an idea that we should explore.
Really good to see Bernie Sanders taking this issue on. I'm going to get to some data here in a second on how Europeans feel about their public news organizations. But to have Bernie finally have a attempt at a solution here, or at least a way to address the problem when it comes to his criticisms around corporate media, is really good to see. So I hope he continues pushing this and making it potentially another pillar of what he stands for on a regular basis. But a couple things here. So Bernie mentions, the two major issues, media culture and lack of local news or lack of investment into public news organizations. On the media culture, just briefly here, this is, again, goes to the issue around framing, but often the way to understand it is, yes, there is a corporate bias, of course, because they're massive corporations. There is a culture. It's about the hiring process as well. They're not going to hire somebody who's going to be asking too many questions around capitalism. That is clear from who you see hosting these shows, because those discussions are not brought up. But it's also just how they view issues generally, and that is from the lens of D.C., Washington, D.C., as opposed to the lens of how does this impact the average person out in the real world in terms of policy? What policy is going to impact the average person? That isn't what they tend to focus on. The focus is always discussing these issues around the framing of the GOP versus the Democratic Party. What is the leadership saying in both of these parties? And that is often what dictates the entire discussion around policy, as opposed to discussing, hey, what should they be discussing? What policies, or maybe some other candidates, or not candidates, other politicians like a Bernie Sanders, what are they trying to propose that isn't being discussed? And maybe we should see if that makes a little more sense in terms of how that would impact the average person. And let's not just limit our discussion to what leadership is saying in both parties. Because again, leadership in both parties, much like corporate media, is run by massive corporations. The amount of money, the amount of lobbyists in Washington, D.C., that is what dictates all of this discussion. So it is on the media's job to analyze that, to be critical of that, and think outside the box and look at other solutions, again, through the framing of the average person, as opposed to the framing of what is happening in Washington, D.C. Now, let's get to some data here I found from Pew Research. This is trust in public news media higher than trust in private media in 8 Western European countries. So this goes to Bernie's point about how there should be more of an investment into public news media. So whether it's, Sweden, UK, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain, all of them have more trust in public news media than private news media. And that isn't to say they're perfect. In Canada, we have the CBC. In fact, in a second here, I'll get to discussing Paris Marx, who was on my show a couple of years ago, discussing how the CBC fails us. There are issues with our public broadcaster and with public broadcasters in other countries, but they're not addressed by making them more corporatized. In fact, the issue is the opposite. Like when it comes to CBC, the issue is the fact that there are advertisements, that there isn't enough of an investment into CBC for real unpartisan coverage as it applies to the working class and not as it applies to, business leaders, which is always the framing is around any economic issue. It's around the business leaders. It's about the job creators, as opposed to the vast majority of people being the workers. Now, also another poll here, majorities in Western Europe more likely to trust public news organizations than distrust them. So when it comes to trust as well, look at Sweden. 90% more likely to trust their public news organization than the private. But down the list, same thing. All across the board, they are more likely to trust the public. Again, because of, I assume there's more of an investment, of course, into public news there. So there is a better functioning system. But you have to imagine people understand, that there are serious issues when it comes to private, massive companies owning what is the discussions going on in politics. Like when you have that clear and obvious bias of a massive corporation dictating what you should be thinking about in terms of the framing around stories, that should bring up red flags immediately, regardless of whatever issue it is. But quickly here, I want to just touch on this interview I had with Paris Marx a couple of years ago. So this was on his piece, "We Need a Robust CBC Now More Than Ever." So again, CBC is Canada's public broadcaster. And if you want to see the full discussion, I'll link to it below the video. Look at my hair. This is at the beginning of the pandemic, before I grew it very long and then eventually cut it, and now it's long again. But anyways, more importantly, in his piece, he writes this one paragraph that I'll share here. So he writes, as a basic starting point, its funding should be increased, ads should be wholly removed, and it should have a mandate to expand local reporting, given how such work is becoming unsustainable for private media to provide. We can also learn from Mill's suggestions for the BBC, which include a more democratic structure that takes away political control in favor of a more democratic system of public accountability. Recruitment that is more representative of the audience, not just in terms of race and gender, but crucially in terms of class as well, and decentralizing editorial control. In addition, the CBC needs to look toward the future, and we should look to Dan Hind's call to move public broadcasting into the 21st century with a digital cooperative that would place a democratically controlled CBC at the center of the creation of a public media and technology ecosystem that serves the public instead of the bottom lines of tech giants. This is an immaculate paragraph. Like, go read this piece. It is fantastic. It's CBC focused, of course, but this applies generally to how media organizations should be run. There should be a democratic system of public accountability, and recruitment should always be based around race, not just race and gender, but also in class. So there should be real diversity when it comes to the hiring process, and a diversity of opinions. Because again, when it comes to hiring, as I said earlier, that is a large piece of the issue here, because these massive corporations are not going to hire anybody who is going to be critical of massive corporations, obviously. But that is why when you have a public broadcaster, there is at least they're more open to hiring those kinds of individuals. And if there is proper investment into how these companies are set up in terms of having a co-op, having it democratically controlled as opposed to having, you know, some wealthy individuals at the top running things, then that also bleeds down into how news is generated. And again, goes to properly framing these issues in a way that further, you know, empathizes with the actual worker as opposed to massive companies and wealthy individuals. Regardless, really good to see Bernie beginning this discussion about potential solutions here and investing more into public news gathering and local news, and I hope he continues this fight.